start another chapter, we'll never get to basics. Okay. I haven't decided exactly how many Purim classes we're doing and how many Pesach classes we're doing.
We're going straight from Purim right into Pesach?
What's in between?
We
We don't have that many classes.
How many classes do we have?
We have 2 this week, 2 next week,
And that's it?
and then it's Purim.
Okay.
And then after that we have 2,
Okay.
another 2, another 2. And that's it. So it's 10 classes. That's,
Crazy.
not enough to do a chapter of Tanya. And, I mean, I can do 5 classes on matzah. I think I did last year 5 classes on matzah. But we'll see. Okay, but today we're going to start with Purim. So, today's class we're going to start with the more controversial stuff. Or the most controversial thing, probably. And then we'll work downwards from there for the next classes. So today's class is going to be about drinking on Purim. Okay? Now, the class is going to be divided into 2 parts. Part number 1 will be a discussion about drinking on Purim in terms of what Torah, what halacha actually says about it. I will not, from the outset, let me make a few things clear. I am not going to explain why people do what they do. I think we all understand that not everybody behaves the way they're supposed to always, right? But I will tell you what it says in different sources. The other thing, as is my want, I will not sugarcoat things or pretend things are other than what they are also. So that was your trigger warning. If you don't want to hear things you might not want to hear, you can leave now. Okay. Then we will talk about a very difficult story in the Gemara regarding drinking and how that story is understood in the light of Chassidus and its relationship to Purim. Okay? That's what we're going to try and cover. So the Gemara, the Talmud, in discussing the obligations of Purim, which there are 4 mitzvahs. We have Shalchmanis to our left, reading the Megillah to our right. We have the giving matas and young gifts of poor to my front, and to my back is Mishta v'Simcha. So Mishta v'Simcha means having a Suda, and the implication there is that it is a Suda involving a festive meal involving drinking and some revelry. So there's a discussion in the Talmud about how these mitzvahs are to perform. What are the rules for Shalchmanis, for instance? How many foods? How many people? And in the discussion about the Suda, this question of when you have to have the meal. For instance, if you have the meal at Purim night, it doesn't count. It has to be during the day. All sorts of interesting rules regarding that. And one of the lines there's a great sage, Rava. And Rava says, the exact quote is Chai v'inish l'mesume b'puria ad lo yada bein ar haman levarach Mordechai, which means a man is required to drink on Purim, to celebrate with wine, to the point that he does not know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman, which sounds like a lot of drinking. Yes? Okay. The Talmud then proceeds to tell a story, which is going to be the story that we're going to go back to later, but right now we're just going to talk about in the context of the actual Jewish practice. The story tells a story of 2 great sages, Rabbah, whose name literally means the great one, and Rabbi Zera, whose name literally means Rabbi Small One. I kid you not. This will be relevant later on. But so Rabbah and Rabbi Zera had their Purim feast together. And they got drunk. So they got drunk. And then Rabbah got up and slaughtered Rabbi Zera. It uses the word shchita, like slaughter, shchita, the knife. It doesn't say with the knife, it just says shchita, he slaughtered him.
Literally?
We're going to talk about that in the second half of the class. But it does say that he shachta lil Rabbi Zera, is the exact quote. He slaughtered Rabbi Zera. The next day, he prayed and revived him from the dead. The next year, Rabbah said to Rabbi Zera, why don't we have our Purim feast together? And Rabbi Zera replied, you can't rely on miracles occurring all the time. And that's the end of the story. Okay, so again, the way that Talmud says this is at first it quotes the law in the name of the great sage Rava, that man is required to drink on Purim until he does not know the difference between blessed is Mordechai, cursed is Haman. And then it brings the story of Rabbi and Rabbi Zera having the Purim suited together, the Purim feast together, Rabbi getting drunk, Rabbi getting up, slaughtering Rabbi Zera, praying the next day and reviving him from the dead, offering to have the suit again next year, and Rabbi Zera refusing because you can't rely on miracles occurring at all times. Okay? So there is a dispute amongst the Talmudic commentators and codifiers, which is, how do we read this passage of Talmud? There are traditionally 3 ways, and then in later halachic authorities, there is a 3rd way. Okay? Way number 1, that this story is brought as evidence that we do not follow the rule that you should drink. Why? Because if you drink, what could happen? Great rabbis could kill each other. This is not a good thing. And therefore, this story serves as a rejection, as a disproof from the previous stated halacha that Rava said that a man is required to drink. So that you would read it as Rava says this is the proper way to do the sukkah, and the Gemara rejects, saying, no, we saw people who did that, it led to bad results, so therefore that is not the proper way. That's one way of reading the passage of Talmud. A second way is the opposite, saying this is proof. Even though that halacha of drinking to such an extent carries a risk, nonetheless we see these great rabbis did it. Therefore, is indication that despite the risk involved, one is required to drink to that degree. Right? So there's literally 2 opposite ways of reading this story. Is it meant to disprove the halacha one is required to drink to such an extent, or is it meant to prove that one is required to drink to such an extent? There is a later view brought in halachic authorities. That's from the Middle Ages, that's dispute. And there's a later view that's brought past a few hundred years, I think, like from the 1600s or something like that, that the way to read it is that the halacha that one is required to drink until one doesn't know the difference between blessed as Mordechai and cursed as Haman is the minimum level, and then the maximum threshold that you shouldn't reach is killing your the other people around you. So the way you read it is that it's not a proof or a disproof. One is setting the minimum and one is setting the upper limit of the maximum of the drinking. So you get a range of how much you're supposed to drink. So there is that other view. But traditionally, the halacha codifiers address these 2 points of view. And all the halacha codifiers rule like the view that this is a supportive position, that in fact the halacha is one is required to drink that much. So if you look in the Code of Jewish Law, it just quotes Rava's teaching verbatim. A man is required to drink on Purim. So he doesn't know the difference between cursed as Haman and blessed as Mordechai. So now what you have is a series of different opinions as to what does that actually mean in practice. Okay? Now I'm not going to go in any sort of chronological order. I'm going to go in order of drunkenness, I think is the best way to put it. Okay? So the first opinion in order of drunkenness is, we know that there was a great sage in the Talmud who had a problem with wine. And he would drink wine this night of the Seder, and he would be sick until Shavuos. So that's 7 weeks of illness due to his drinking of wine. And that was the only time he drank wine. Now, there is an obligation to drink 4 cups of wine at the night of the Seder. If there was a genuine obligation to drink wine to get drunk at the Purim Suda, then he would have had to do that at Purim as well. So what do we see from this? That even though the language is that one is obligated to, it is not such a strong obligation. Because it was such an actual obligation, like say the obligation to drink 4 cups of wine, then he would have done it on Purim as well.
Did they only have wine as alcohol?
So I'm not going to get into this, but the straightforward reading is the word that's used there is getting drunk with wine. Later, halachic authorities discuss whether it has to be wine, but the actual word that's used refers to getting drunk with wine. Rashi, in his comments, says to get drunk with wine. I'm not going to spend any time on the wine part specifically right now. Okay. So the standard view in halacha is that if there is any sort of reason why one should not be drinking, they should not drink. They're broadly outlined 3 reasons. Number 1, physical health. If it is physically not proper for somebody to drink, they would be ill, whatever. Okay? Modern halachic authorities extend this to mental health. Obviously, certain people, simple example would be someone who has an alcohol issue, right? But there are other people who suffer from other types of mental illnesses, right? Extend that as well. One does not risk their mental health either. The third thing which is brought in halachic authorities, if one reasonably is concerned that when one drinks, they would act in a way that is contrary to what the Torah says they are allowed to do, they are not allowed to drink. or they're not drink to that point. So this would range from everything from getting so drunk that you end up not making brachas, or you pass out and don't daven Maariv, or you get violent, or you speak in such a way that is improper for a Jew to be speaking, right? If that's going to happen, then you're not allowed to drink, okay? So whatever level this obligation has, it's not like drinking the 4 cups of wine at the Seder, which you have to do even if it would make you sick, as long as it wouldn't endanger your life.
But you could do grape juice.
Yeah, but you could have a mild grape allergy, right? And I'm not getting into the ways around this, but at the end of the day, if there is a positive obligation and it carries no risk of life, just serious pain and discomfort, you still have to do it. Okay. But that does not apply to this. Okay. Now, the next level up is that one should drink a little bit more than they're used to drinking and go to sleep, because you drank and you don't know the difference between anything while you're sleeping. So, and that is the view of Rav Moshe Isserlis. This is the Ashkenazic halachic authority in the Shulchan Aruch. That's what he says, that's what you can do. And many great rabbis, that is what they've done. Generally not of the Hasidic persuasion, but many great rabbis, the way they would celebrate Purim is they would have a Purim Suda, they would drink a little bit more than the normal, and they would take a nap afterwards. Okay. Then there is another view, which is that there was a drinking song that existed in the times of the Talmud that had its lines. At the end of every line, there would be "Blessed is Haman" or "Cursed is Mordechai." I'm not advocating, drinking to the point that you're using drinking songs, but one of the things about drinking songs is that they can be quite funny when a person is too drunk to remember which line you're supposed to say when. And so the idea is that you get so drunk that you start mixing up the lines of the drinking song, which is not that drunk, let's be honest. Okay. It's not like you've lost all sense of morality or anything. Okay. There is another view, so that's actually a view that's on the side of the Shulchan Aruch, on the major commentators. Remember correctly, it's the Magen Avram, but I didn't bother to check right now, so I could be mixing them up. I think that's his view. There's another view, which is that this is referring to a philosophical issue, which is that there are 2 miracles that occur in the Purim story. One is the salvation of the Jewish people, blessed is Mordechai, and the downfall of the wicked, cursed is Haman. Which is a greater praise to God, the salvation of the righteous, the punishment of the wicked? This is an interesting philosophical, religious issue. When you are too drunk to have a coherent conversation about that, or even care about the difference, you're just too celebratory about both miracles that it's all the same to you, then you've drunk enough. In other words, that you cannot appreciate the difference between these 2 vantage points.
Also not so drunk.
What?
That's also not so drunk.
It's also not so drunk, right? You're starting to realize right? So it's more than a little bit and going to sleep, but it's not. Neither of these are crazy drunk, right? They're more in the realm of like mildly tipsy type of things, but shouldn't be driving. I'm warning you, by the way, the controversial stuff I'm saving for the end of the halacha stuff. Okay. Then there is the view of the Rambam. And the Rambam says that one should get drunk until they fall asleep in a drunken stupor. Into a drunken stupor. They get so drunk that they just fall asleep. Not that they went to sleep, but that they actually
Can't stay awake.
they fall asleep because of how drunk they are. Which, by the way, is not also that drunk. And if one drinks with that intent, as long as you can drink that and then get that place very quickly, and you don't actually have that long of being like completely crazy. I'm not recommending. I'm just saying that that's it. Okay. Now, the actual Shulchan Aruch itself, or Rav Yosef Kairo's Shulchan Aruch, he just literally quotes the halach without qualifying it, so it's an open question what he meant.
What if you don't get drunk?
One second.
Yeah, I thought this was the first opinion.
What?
The first opinion you said.
The first opinion, if one wants to fulfill this halacha, is to drink a little bit extra and...
No, I'm saying, what if you drink and you don't get drunk?
It's happened, unfortunately.
To who?
To me. It's fine. Sometimes it doesn't happen. It happened for it doesn't work. Okay. But yes. Look, I mean, if you try to do a mitzvah and you didn't succeed. What are you supposed to do? I mean,
No, but the first opinion you said
was
that...
Oh, if there's a good reason to not drink.
Yeah,
then you don't have to drink, right? It's not, in other words, it's not the kind of things like I'm going to have to push myself to do this. It's not the kind of, like, if health-wise, physical or mental, or, there's...
Even if you decide if I decide, for example, I don't want to drink alcohol, I don't want to start with it, is it also a good reason to
Wait. I'm going to wait for all of the questions about this till the end. Okay? Because then I'll do the controversial thing, and then you can ask all your questions then, and it'll be all wonderful.
At what age does this start?
Halachically, presumably 13. The fact that there's local laws and one has to deal with that, that's obviously an issue. One should not risk going to jail because you gave alcohol to minors for Purim. No.
Should you break laws to follow mitzvahs?
I'm not going into it.
Because
the simple answer.
Other situations you would.
The simple answer is there are situations where yes, and there's situations where no. It depends the law. It depends the halacha. It depends. All those things matter. Okay. This is my point. Is it's not such a serious obligation. Having a meal is a serious obligation. Whether you drink or not is not that serious of an obligation, right? Because again, Rav Yosef didn't drink at all. From the close, right? Remember, close Rav Yosef. Okay. Now there is the view of the Shulchan Aruch just quotes it. So one could say that he means to get completely wildly drunk, but even there we remember that if someone's wildly drunk, that they're going to act in a way that's contrary to what the Torah says, then they wouldn't be allowed to do so. So it's an open question whether he means more drunk than the Rambam of getting so drunk you fall asleep, crazy drunk or not, but it's an open question. And that's as far as you go. No one actually says you're supposed to get so drunk that you lose your sense of morality and right and wrong. Let's be clear about this. Okay? Good? Now, women drinking on Purim. There's no such thing. Well, I'm going to have a very brief discussion about it. Okay. Number one, there is a general rule in the Torah against drunkenness. And so we have a principle that we do not bake general principles based off exceptions. Okay, so in other words, if you have a general principle that something is forbidden, and in one situation the Torah allows it, that doesn't mean, now we can extend that to other things, right? Mm-hmm. So we know that the Torah really looks down on drunkenness. This is a well-established thing in all sorts of sources. I'm not going to go into them. And the Torah does say there's Kiddush, there's 4 cups of wine at the Seder. Men have an obligation to drink some amount of wine on the pilgrimage festivals to fulfill the mitzvah of rejoicing. So the idea of extending the Purim obligation beyond what we have clear evidence for would be not conforming to halachic practice. We also have another thing, which is that halachic practice is not purely textual, it's also mimetic, which means it goes based on what PC people do. We have zero tradition of women making a point of drinking alcohol at the Purim Suda to get drunk. And when it comes to things that are put into practice, we have a principle that if you haven't seen it, that's a proof that that's not what we do. Okay? In other words, even though we would say absence of evidence is not evidence to the contrary, that doesn't apply when we talk about actual real life practice. Okay? There's a lot of areas in it. So before we get into anything more principle, just on a very basic level, we see that there's disputes as to how this halacha should be applied. But when we look into the actual practice, how halacha has been practiced over the generations before the modern era, we do not see women. We see women making sure they drink 4 cups of wine at the Seder, women making sure that they hear Kiddush, women eating matzah, women hearing Megillah, women participating in the Suda. We do not see a point of women going out and making sure that they have alcohol to drink. So that's already one thing. The second thing, there is a distinct issue in the Talmud about women getting drunk in public settings. That itself in the Talmud says very clearly is itself a problem. And so halachic authorities, more contemporary ones that have discussed this issue, have brought that into effect as well. Which means, in practice, if one is coming to this purely from desire to do the will of God and follow the religious tradition, there is no idea, and in fact may in fact be prohibited for women to drink in public settings. In practice, what would that mean? If you're of the culture where you would normally drink a wine with a meal, like a Shabbos meal, you normally have a glass of wine, so there's obviously no reason not to have a glass of wine by Purim. But the idea, because it's Purim, I'm now going to have extra alcohol, is not really a true thing for women. I know that's controversial, but they're like said. So all of your questions of do I have to, do I not have to, be resolved. Yes.
So the people who think it's a mitzvah to drink are only saying for drinking at the Suda?
Yes, it's in the context of how the Suda should be performed, yes.
Because, I don't know if we're going to talk about how things are done today.
I said from the outset, I am not going to justify people's conduct. I just go through the sources and what the halachic authorities say about the matter of how the mitzvah should be done.
Right. It just makes it seem like that drinking is like the whole holiday.
Well, yes. And halachic authorities do speak about the wayward youth who think that Purim is just an excuse to get drunk, and they're wrong. Right? That is also mentioned. Right?
But if it's a Suda, doesn't that mean it's like how does it make it different from like the Seder when you're in your house? Like
In terms of what?
Unless you're like, because it's not like public.
Public, I didn't define the term public. Public means outside the context of a husband and wife in an isolated setting, just the two of them.
Just like two individual people.
Yeah, specifically two individual people, one is a husband, one is a wife. Outside that context, women imbibing alcohol is something that is very frowned upon in the Talmud and may in fact be halachically forbidden. Again, beyond what's considered normal, like not like the alcohol itself is forbidden, like a normal glass of wine at a meal or something like that, but like getting actually to the point where you can't drive home kind of thing, or shouldn't be driving home, much less beyond anything beyond that. Okay? And again, I want to be clear that from the Talmudic perspective, it's not considered to be a positive thing in general for men either. There's just considered to be a much stronger issue when it comes to women, to the possibility that may consider to be prohibited. There's some discussion about the Talmud and later halachic authorities, not actually medieval authorities as well about it. Yeah.
If it's just a party like just for women without men, they can.
I don't issue halachic rulings. Okay? I can just tell you the facts. Okay? I didn't tell you that it's forbidden, but I am telling you that if you're doing it, it's not because, I'm not talking about your motivations, but from the point of view of our tradition, there is nothing that indicates that it doesn't make your celebration of Purim any more proper to do it. Okay, so if you like getting tipsy and you want to get tipsy and you don't care what the Torah says, you just want to make sure that you're not sinning. I don't know, ask your local rabbi, but if you're saying like as a proper way to celebrate Purim, am I celebrating Purim more properly by getting tipsy? The answer would be no. Okay, and if it's in a setting where there may be elements of, mixed gender interactions, even if afterwards you go out on the street and types of things after you have the alcohol, then you run into a question that it may even be prohibited. Again, there's disputes about that. I'm not a halakha authority. I don't get into those issues, but they are good. All right. Now we have to get back to Rabbah getting drunk, getting up and slaughtering Rabbi Zera, because that seems to be a bit of an inappropriate piece of behavior. Yes.
Wait, so there's no consensus and these different opinions
No.
of how much to drink?
No.
Okay.
No.
But none of them say that you need to like get plastered.
No. There is no view that says that you need to get plastered. Unless you go with the view that plastered means drunk to such an extent that you fall asleep drunk. There is such a view. That's the Rambam's view. But like I said,
And there's no like measuring quantity. It's like drunkenness.
yeah, it's actually drunkenness. It's interesting because other times where there's a requirement to drink wine, there's actual and a certain quantity of alcohol, right? Yes. It's a very weird halacha, to be honest. The actual interesting thing is the Code of Jewish Law ruled this way because there's a strong argument to make that the other reading makes a lot more sense. But whatever, that's not how the halachic consensus developed. Okay. I will mention that something the Rebbe did by his Verbrengens is the Rebbe would say someone should be appointed to fulfill the mitzvah in its literal sense on behalf of everyone else. So usually be like one older chassid who would just drink until he was, completely.
And then, was like, it's everybody?
And that was the Rebbe's. The Rebbe had their friends. The chassid that did that usually would the chassid, I forgot his name, but he had such respect for the Rebbe that you couldn't tell he was drunk the entire time. He would just like stand there like the Rebbe. But one year after he was asked to do it, and he did it, so the Rebbe finished the Verbrengen, and he turned to the person next to him and says, "Tell my wife I'm not coming home," and just collapsed. But as long as the Rebbe's in the room, like he held himself together. But whatever. But, okay, fine. Be that as it may. Rabbah getting drunk and getting up and slaughtering Rabbi Zera seems to be a bit of an inappropriate thing to do. Yes? Okay. Now, so the first thing that we need to know is that when we have stories in the rabbinic writings, the Talmud, the Midrash, and things like that, it is a legitimate question how literal they should be taken. Okay? When I say it's a legitimate question, there are different opinions, different views on the matter. However, meaning that some stories can be understood as metaphor, as allegory. Okay, I'll tell you one of my favorite stories. The Talmud, Rabbi Babrachana, it's a great sage, he once saw a giant frog. You tell this story before?
No.
And the Talmud interrupts and says, how big was the frog? And the Talmud answers, it was the size of the village of Hargunya. He says it was the size of the village of Hargunya. And the Talmud interrupts and says, well, how big was the village of Hargunya? And it says it was the size of 60 houses. It's a big frog. Anyway, Rabbi Baruch resumes his story. He says, then a snake came and swallowed the frog. Then a raven came and swallowed the snake. And then it went and sat on a tree. See how strong that tree is? And then Rav Shmuel, the son of Papa, said, if I hadn't been there, I wouldn't have believed it. So it's pretty universal. I won't say it's absolutely universal. It's pretty universal amongst Talmudic commentators to understand that that is a metaphor. That whatever he's describing was not an actual giant frog, because, as the Maharal puts it, what would be the point of saying that, right? Not because it's fantastical, but simply because it's meaningless. God can do miracles, but so there are different views as to how literal or not literal. The general rule is that one should always interpret the story in a way that makes the sages look like they are conveying truth and wisdom and divine knowledge, and not fools and idiots. And obviously, people have different opinions as to how to make sense of that and where to draw the lines. That being said, there are certain stories that you really don't have that flexibility, and that's when the story is being used as case law to prove halacha. Because in halacha we actually practice in the physical world, and so if you have a story that is brought in the rabbinic literature as evidence for how you should or should not practice a particular mitzvah, then we have to say that that is not a metaphor, that is not allegory, that actually happened. And remember, this story was brought in the Talmud as either proof or disproof for the obligation to drink on Purim, which means Rabbi really, and Rabbi and Rabbi Zera really did have a Purim Suda. They really did get drunk. Rabbi really did get up and really did slaughter Rabbi Zera. He also really did pray to have him bring him back to life the next day, but that's fine, because Talmudic sages bringing dead people back to life is like not a big deal. They do that all the time. Okay? So you say, okay, fine, he did it. The problem is, Rabbah was a very, very righteous person. How righteous was Rabbah? So some of us have studied some Tanya, and we're familiar with the idea of a Beinani. So Rabbah is the famous, I'm a Beinani, and Rava's, no, you can't be a Beinani. That would be setting the standard too high. You must be a tzaddik. That Rabbah. The Rabbah who the angel of death couldn't kill him because he was always studying Torah with such holiness. That Rabbah. Kind of hard to think of Rabbah being guilty of manslaughter because he got too drunk. Seems a bit inconsistent. So, and again, to say that it is allegory or metaphor is also a problem. It doesn't, you can't, this kind of story, you can't do that with. So you're really kind of stuck. So traditionally, many of the commentators, what they try to do is deal with the story and understand it within the realm of what's called guzma, or exaggeration. Okay? In other words, there's a difference between saying something is allegory and metaphor versus saying something is exaggeration. I'll explain to you. Have you ever been at a concert? Yeah? Okay. Could you imagine someone was a really big concert and you say, well, how was it? You say, there was 1 million people there. And you didn't actually, you don't mean the number million, like 1,000 times 1,000. What you mean is a lot of people, right? And we understand that in context that very often people use the number million, they just mean a lot, right? Right? Or I'm starving means I'm just really hungry. Right? You're actually starving and we need to get you to a hospital because there's a malnutrition issue going on here, right? So, and that's different from saying that, God has a hand where you don't actually mean he has a hand. That's supposed to be a metaphor for something. Right. Good. So we do know that the Talmud does have expressions that are exaggerations. So the question is whether maybe this can be understood that Rabbah got a little rowdy and things crossed a few lines. Maybe he hit Rabbi Zera and injured him. Maybe he insulted him, because when you insult somebody, it's like murdering them. And then he apologized. Maybe it's an exaggerated thing. Okay? And that's how a lot of the classic commentators try to deal with that, because, to just simply interpret it as an allegory or metaphor, you can also interpret it that way, but you can't only interpret it that way because it's being brought as halachic evidence, but also to say that he would conduct himself in such a manner, even with alcohol, is kind of inexcusable, especially for someone as great as Rabbah. Also, notice Rabbah doesn't seem to be the slightest bit, remorseful about what he did, because next year, let's have a party again. Also notice Rabbi Zera doesn't seem to be bothered by what happened. He just doesn't think he can rely on the miracle. He doesn't say, you killed me last time. He said, the resurrection part is what I'm not sure about. So, there are differing ways to deal with this. The Rebbe, in a famous talk, actually gave a new and novel explanation. And what's especially powerful about this explanation is that it's not like adding an added layer, an added dimension. What he's basically doing is there's a simple, straightforward problem. We have a story which we have to take not as metaphor, not as allegory in context. We also have that the characters in the story, Rab and Rabbi Zera, do not seem to be behaving in the story in a way that is consistent with their character portrayed in the Talmud at all. Especially Rabbi seems to be the exact opposite. So how are we supposed to deal with this? And what the Rebbe does is the Rebbe reinterprets the story very creatively, but keeping it within its literal context. And in doing so also provides a deeper insight into what Purim is all about. And that's what we're going to do, have the rest of the class about. Okay. Now I'm going to start in the middle. Okay. Because I want to anchor this explanation in a particular way before we get to the explanation, which is the Talmud uses a very interesting word to describe Rabbah killing Rabbi Zera, which is that he slaughtered him. Shachtelei Rabbi Zera. Now, translation is a very important thing because words do not have a single meaning. Words have shades of meaning, families of meaning. Okay? There are two words that are basically mean slaughter in Hebrew. Tvicha and shchita. There's actually another word, which is zvicha. Actually, there's third. So zvicha, which means slaughter, tends to mean in more of a ritual sense. So a zevach is also, if you ever see the Hebrew word zevach, it will be translated as a sacrifice. Zvicha means slaughtering in a ritual, sacrificial sense. Tvicha means slaughtering in the sense of like killing a living creature using some sort of violent thing to destroy the body. Okay. Also, interestingly related to the word mitbach, because a tabach would be a butcher or a cook. Words change and morph their meaning, right? Okay, but shchita is a very interesting word. Shchita, our sages say, ein shachat el mashach, which means that the word shchita always means to draw, which both has a literal connotation, that the act of shchita means drawing the knife along the neck, but it also means that you're drawing something, you're moving something from one state to another state. It is always used in a constructive sense. And to put this in another framing, the laws of Shabbos, there are 39 prohibited actions. All of those are understood to be constructive activities. So you have building and destroying. Building is obviously constructive because you're building something. What about destroying? Why is destroying constructive? You're destroying the building. And therefore, the actual biblical destroying that is biblically prohibited, rabbinically, other destroying is also prohibited. But biblically, what's prohibited is when the destruction is part of the process of remodeling for building. Erasing is the biblical prohibition of erasing on Shabbos is erasing in order to rewrite. See how they're constructive, they're not destructive, yes? So there's a prohibition of shchita. Shchita doesn't mean just killing, but killing in some sort of constructive sense. So it is odd, if you are aware of the linguistics here, that it doesn't say the standard expressions of killing that there are throughout the Talmud. Katla Rabbi Zera, he killed him or something like that, or murdered him. It just says he slaughtered him. And again, in English, when I say slaughter, right, I think that probably if I would ask you the next words that come to mind probably have something to do with blood and gore and violence, yes? Okay.
Now, slaughter, I feel like is for meat.
Good. Okay, so the Hebrew word shchita is primarily used in the context of making meat from an animal to kosher food for a Jew to eat. So you are, in a sense, elevating it. Another interesting nuance that's pointed out is that when the Jews sinned and God says that he's going to kill them off in the desert, what word does he use for killing them off? Shchita. Interesting. It's odd. Okay, it has that important nuance, which means it sounds like Rabbah did not pull out a knife and cut Rabbi Zera's throat, because while it may be true that slicing the neck of a kosher animal may in fact be elevating it and doing something constructive and that now becomes kosher food, That is not true when, God forbid, someone uses a knife against another person, that they're doing anything constructive, unless it's surgery, obviously. Okay? Now, but to be fair, shechita also does mean killing, right? That is the meaning of the word. So the Rebbe concludes from this particular nuance that we're talking about a very unique form of killing. Not that he didn't kill him. He did kill him. He died. He was dead. And he had to be revived from the dead. But the killing was achieved, or the killing was caused by something other than just violence. Okay? And this involves some notion of elevation. Also, if you look a little bit earlier in the text, it says that Rabbah got up. Kam Rabbah v'shachar, he got up and slaughtered him. So this idea of Rabbah elevating himself, then him doing some act which involves improving and elevating, but also involves death. And the result of that is Rabbi Zera dies. And so from these kinds of textual nuances, the Rebbe understands that what happened was, I'm going to say the point, I'm going to elaborate on it, is Rabbah got drunk and Rabbi Zera got drunk. So it says they got drunk with wine. And as a result of drinking wine, they were able to move to greater spiritual heights, which we'll talk about afterwards what that means. And Rabbah was more of the spiritual guide, and Rabbi Zera was the spiritual acolyte. And what happened? What happens if you go too high that you can't handle?
Die.
Your soul might not be able to maintain its connection to the body, and the result is Rabbi Zera dropped dead. Not because he was hit with an object, not because he was cut with a knife, but because he experienced something that did not allow him to continue living. We have a similar idea going back to, this is how Sarah, matriarch, died, is that when she heard the news of the binding of Isaac, the Kedes Yitzchak, which was not her test, it was Avram's test, so that news was too traumatic for her, and she died as a result.
Happened on Sinai, no?
What? We have this idea on Har Sinai as well. We also have this idea, and more importantly and specifically related to this specifically, we have a similar idea with the sons of Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, who also die, which we're going to come back to them as well. So what we have here is not Rabbah engaging in some sort of inappropriate action such as violence or aggression and killing Rabbi Zera, but Rabbah maybe pushing the boundaries of what is spiritually advisable with someone as small in spiritual stature as Rabbi Zera, and dying as a result. Now, would that fit literally what happens? It does fit what literally happens. Does it mean that now the story really did happen? This really is, and it's key. This is important to the Rebbe's explanation. This is a result of the alcohol. The alcohol is not an incidental part of it. It is critical to the understanding of what happens, which I'm going to explain. And then this also helps us understand something else, which is why Rabbi Zera and Rabbah don't seem to be particularly bothered about repeating this again next year. Because what Rabbah is offering to do is saying, let's do the same thing. We'll have a Purim Suda. We'll have the alcohol. We'll go to spiritual heights, right? And that's a good thing, right? And what about the consequence that Rabbi Zera may die as a result of that process? That doesn't seem to bother Rabbah, and it doesn't seem to bother Rabbi Zera. What does seem to bother Rabbi Zera is the possibility that'll stay dead, right? He says we can't rely on the mirror. So that makes everything fit actually quite precisely in the language of the Talmud, while keeping the story not as an allegory, not as a metaphor, but a real event that occurred, showing the consequences of how we drink so much on Purim.
It doesn't have to actually mean like slicing someone.
It does, and if you're shechting someone halachically.
But like using the word shchita.
No, so I'll give you another example where you see that the word shchita is not meant literally in that way. This is a little bit graphic, but so there's a section of Talmud that says that if you see an Am Ha'aretz, which I'm going to leave that term undefined for a moment, okay? See an Am Ha'aretz on Yom Kippur, which is Shabbos, you should stab him. Yes, and he uses the word nechir. Nechir means killing through stabbing. And nechira is always used in contrast to shchita, because how would Gentiles and pagans kill an animal for slaughter? They just stab it, bleed it out. And so it's nechira. And the I forget which sage says this, when the students say, well, why nechira? Why not shchita? Actually ask. And he says, because shchita requires a blessing. Because shchita, you're elevating something, you're making it better, so it requires a blessing. Now, an Am Ha'aretz is a person. Okay? Generally, an Am Ha'aretz is someone who is ignorant of Torah. Whatever that passage of Talmud means, it clearly does not mean the students are considering that maybe instead of stabbing him with a knife, they should slit his throat with a shechita knife, and then the only reason we don't do that is because then we'd have to make a bracha. Like that wouldn't that make sense? That's ridiculous. So clearly, the idea here is this Am Ha'aretz in this context is bad in some way, and there's an idea of getting rid of him or killing him, whether that's meant to be literal or metaphoric, that's not really the point. And the students are saying, well, we could have done that in a more constructive manner, and there's some reason why we don't want to do it in a constructive manner. And that's clear in the context. So you do see that this idea of shechita has a more generalized meaning when it's not used in the halacha context of killing animals for food. But it retains the meaning of, yes, it involves death, but it also retains the meaning of it involves something that is being improved or elevated or constructive. Okay. Which is why you would normally use it referring to one person killing another person, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay. Now, one other interesting little thing. Do you remember the two rabbis' names who were participants in the story?
Rabbi and Rabbi Zera.
Rabbi and Rabbi Zera. What does Rabbi mean?
Allah.
The great one. And what does Rabbi Zera mean? Rabbi Small. So the great one and this Rabbi Small got drunk on Purim, and for some reason drinking and experiencing high spiritual, states, whatever, somehow related, which we'll talk about in a second. And Rabbah kept going higher and higher and the great one tried to take the small one along with him. And then what happened? He elevated to the point where it resulted in the small one's death. Right? The wording all becomes very, very precise now. Even the names of the people involved.
They were really called.
Yeah, that was really their names. Rabbah was really called Rabbah. He's one of the major sages in the Talmud. He's all over the place.
Is it like a nickname because of that?
Yes, it was a nickname. Some of the sages have nicknames, or their abbreviations. Yeah. So Rabbah means the great one. I don't remember. It was Rabbah bar Nachmani, Rabbah the son of Nachmani. He had a famous nephew named Nachman, who was an orphan that he raised. And because he never wanted to call his nephew Nachman because his own father's name was Nachman, so he called him Daddy, little Daddy. But he did it in Aramaic, so his name was Abaye. And then when he became a great sage, he was just known as Abaye. So Abaye just means like Tato, little daddy. And that was his name. So his actual name was Nachman. Or Nachmani. So yeah, anyway, there's all sorts of interesting things in the Talmud about people's names and who gets titles and who doesn't and who gets known by nicknames. And some people, what ends up happening is their name and their title get crashed together into one word. There was like a rabbi named Rav Avina. But people found that too difficult to say, so just started calling him Ravina. So there you go. Yes. So, but Rabbah, I don't know what Rabbah's actual name was, but I don't think they named him Rabbah. But he was known as Rabbah. But Zera was actually his name, as far as I know. There's actually two versions. Zera is Ze'eri. In Israel, he's known as Ze'eri, and in Babylonia, his name is Zera. Anyway, so the question is, okay, this is all very nice, but what does getting drunk have to do with experiencing spiritual elevations and such things? So I want to approach this on three levels. Or not three levels, three tracks. One, there is the track of Jewish mysticism. So then there's going to be the track of human psychology. And then finally there's going to be the track that we're going to approach, which is the biblical narrative. Okay? So first, Kabbalistically. Wine is associated with secrets. As a famous expression goes, Nichnas yayin yotza soid, that the wine enters and the secret comes out. Why is this the case Kabbalistically? That when wine goes in, the secret comes out? And the answer is, because the wine itself is a secret. Why is the wine itself a secret?
It's like the inner part of the grape.
That's right. It's in the grape. And how do you get the wine out? You squeeze the grape to get the wine out. Now, So the idea is that Kabbalistically, wine is a physical embodiment of the revelation of a secret. And that's how it's understood. So it is not that there's certain chemical properties to alcohol, blah, 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 blah. No, the actual production of wine is the physical embodiment of the spiritual idea of revealing a secret. Something which is intrinsically hidden, right, comes out into the open. And therefore it can be absorbed. Right? So the idea is that when we talk about mysticism, it's in principle connected to wine. So for instance, we know that Torah is associated with different foods. So for instance, we consider Torah to be bread. Why do we consider Torah bread? Because it's our sustenance, right? Bread is the Hebrew word lechem. Bread actually is a general word for food that sustains you in general, and bread in particular, which is the main thing that sustains a person. It's also compared to water. Torah is considered to be water. Okay? There's all sorts of different things. We compare the Torah to wine, and when we referring to Torah in the context of wine, that is generally understood to refer to the mystical dimension of the Torah. Kabbalah, Chassidus, whatever. Okay? So often, for instance, in the Rebbe's talks, when the Rebbe is discussing a comment of Rashi, after he explains the comment of Rashi, he'll then say, now some of the wine of the Torah that's hidden in the Rashi, and then show you a Chassidic insight that's embedded there. But that expression, Yena Torah, the wine of the Torah, means the secret of Torah. Because again, wine is the physical embodiment of revealing the secret. There's also this dimension of oil as well. We're not going to differentiate right now between wine and oil. But oil is also a notion of the secrets, but on a totally different level. Okay. Now, wine also, and this is important for also the Seder, the 4 cups of wine, wine is contrasted with water. Okay. For instance, in the temple, they would have a libation offering, which is you pour wine on the altar, and on Sukkot, they would in addition pour water on the altar. Wine and water are contrasted. This is a very common theme in the ancient world, including in the Tanakh and in the rabbinic literature. And one of the key differences between wine and water is that wine tastes good, and water tastes like nothing. Which is why, what bracha do you make on water?
Cool.
Yeah, you don't make a bracha on water unless you're thirsty. No, this is important. Like if you're taking a pill, you don't make a bracha on water. If you're dehydrated and your trainer says you need to drink more water, but you're not actually thirsty, because that can happen.
You don't say bracha.
Well, what does that mean?
You only say bracha when you feel thirst and you want to quench your thirst. You know that experience? Then you make a bracha shakal. If you're drinking water for other reasons, you do not make a bracha on it. Because you're not quenching your thirst. You're not having that feeling from drinking the water because you weren't thirsty. You didn't feel the thirst. And it doesn't taste like anything. So,
What if you have another reason for drinking water?
such as?
Like the fact that it's healthy to drink 2 liters of water every day.
So this is an issue. If you're drinking the water for that reason, if you don't actually feel thirsty, you don't make a bracha on it.
No, but I don't feel thirsty, but I feel like it will be good for me.
No. You have to actually feel the physical sensation of a dry mouth, of thirsty, like I'm looking for. We all know what it means to feel thirsty.
So what if you eat when you're not hungry?
No, that's because food tastes good. Food has taste. Anything that has a taste, you make a bracha on it. For instance, medicine. If you take medicine, do you make a bracha on it? If it has a taste.
Really? If it's grape flavored?
Yep, grape flavored medicine, you make a bracha.
Shakal?
If you put stuff in your water, like electrolytes, that's
Does it have taste?
Yeah.
What does it taste like?
No, but it's a flavor.
Then you
Like strawberry,
make
lemon.
make a bracha. Yeah. Flavored water needs a bracha. Water is flavorless, halachically speaking. And it's contrasted with wine. So wine, which also, and this is the idea is that wine, flavor is the idea that you can actually absorb it, you get it, you relate to it, it speaks to you, it resonates to you, it makes you feel good, right? The idea of wine is this idea of there's a secret, which it's a secret, it's hidden, and it's being revealed as a big deal. But when it's revealed, it's something that actually touches you and moves you and you appreciate it. Right? It's not something that remains totally beyond you. Okay? And so the Kabbalists understand that the drinking of wine is itself a way to become connected to the levels of spirituality, the levels of godliness, which are more of the secret. And this is based on an important Kabbalistic idea, which is that the physical actions that we do directly correlate with spiritual reality. This is why Kabbalah is so significant in Judaism, is because Kabbalah gives an underpinning to halacha that is very hard to explain otherwise. So, for instance, are you familiar with that halacha has a lot of very technical details? Also, that halacha doesn't really tend to care so much about you as an individual, but cares a lot about the categories. That makes a lot of sense if everything that's happening in our physical lives is, has a mirror image in the spiritual world, and as we do things, it aligns perfectly and makes those spiritual things. The idea is that when somebody who is a deep Torah scholar, who is somebody who's familiar with the more secret dimensions of the Torah, and they want to have a sense of that in a deeper, truer way, which I'm going to say in a second what that is, and they can use wine because of its spiritual properties linked to this spiritual dimension of the secrets, as a way to get them in touch with that, and then they'll have a deeper sense of the secrets of the Torah. That would be a Kabbalistic explanation. Okay? Does that mean everybody that drinks wine all of a sudden becomes aware of the spiritual realm of the spheres? It doesn't mean that. It obviously doesn't mean that. It means it helps facilitate and align and attune that person if they're otherwise predisposed to be able to do so. And so from a Kabbalistic point of view, it would make sense that Rabbah and Rabbi Zera, if they want to have a deeper sense of the secrets of the Torah, and especially on a holiday which is very wine-centered, right? The entire story of Purim centers around wine, that this is the holiday that is geared towards using that dynamic to get in touch with the deeper dimensions of the Torah, and they would drink and try to do that. Now, one quick little story, and then you can ask a question. Someone had a question. The Baal Shem Tov was a controversial figure. One of the people who was very skeptical, if not outright critical of the Baal Shem Tov, was a Rabbi Dovber of Mizrich. And he was eventually persuaded to go and check out the Baal Shem Tov. It's a longer story, we're not going to go into how that happened. But one of the things that happened when he came to kind of check out the Baal Shem Tov is the Baal Shem Tov asked him if he studies Kabbalah. He said, yes. And he said, so there's a work called Eitz Chaim, which is the Kabbalistic teachings of the Arizal. And the Baal Shem Tov opened the Sefer, the book, to a certain place, and he says, this passage, can you read it and explain it to me? So, Rabbi Dover of Mizrich, he read the passage and he explained it, and the Baal Shem Tov says, that's not what's written there. And he looked at it again. Said, I think that is what's written. I think that is the meaning. And the Baal Shem Tov says, no, that's not what you didn't explain the meaning correctly. That's not the meaning there. And so he says, turns the book back and says, okay, well, if you think that's what, you explain it. You read it and explain it. And so the Baal Shem Tov said, stand up on your feet, which is the Talmudic expression for I'm about to reveal the secrets of the Torah. Whenever the Talmudic sages would reveal secrets of the Torah, they would tell the other one to stand up on their feet. And then he proceeds to read the same passage, and he explains it the exact same way that Rabbi Dover is rich, without any difference, except Dover said afterwards that when the Baal Shem Tov read the words and explained them, everything he talked about I experienced. When he spoke about this particular angel or sphere, whatever it was, I actually experienced what that was. Okay? So when we speak about higher secrets, we're speaking about moving from the realm of language and ideas into the realm of something that is much more experiential. That's the true secrets of the Torah. And that's why when you look at Kabbalistic writings, they're very hard to understand. Because imagine you've had a particular experience and you write it and you don't try to explain your experience, you just use language that to you reflects that experience. If someone hasn't had a similar experience, they won't know what that means, right? So let's say I've never been to the ocean, right? And you've been to the ocean. You say, I was at the ocean and it was breathtaking. So I'm reading that and I have no idea what you mean. I don't know what an ocean is. I've never seen an ocean. What did it mean that it was breathtaking, right? But anyone's been to the ocean immediately understands what you mean by that, right? You don't need a fancy philosophical explanation. Okay. So the idea is that that's really what it means to get in touch with the secrets of Torah in the deepest sense, in the realest sense. And wine, because of what wine is an embodiment of, that spiritual energy, if one imbibes wine correctly in the right context, on the right day, such as the holiday of Purim, which is a festival that is wine-centered, for the right reasons, that would facilitate that. And then the result might be that you might end up experiencing things that you can't handle and die. Back to Rabbi Zera. Okay?
How is everyone able to drink wine? You don't have to be a Torah scholar to drink wine, to get the secrets.
according to Kabbalah, if you're asking this from the perspective of Kabbalah, according to Kabbalah, it is the rare person that the practice of halacha is meant to enrich their experience of God. The primary thing is that your practice of halacha helps bring alignment and unity to the spiritual realms, and only the truly spiritually sensitive and holy who abstain from any sort of physical animalistic indulgence will ever be able to experience any of that. So, yes. That goes back to the categories, because like when you do something, it links up based on, let's say that your tribe or your gender or the day or this, whether you experience it or not doesn't really matter. And then like these great people, the Arizal, Moshe Cordovero, the Baal Shem Tov. Anyway, so this Rabbi Dovber, he was very taken by this and several other things, and he decided to become a disciple and became very famous. By the way, his job in Mizrich was he was the local preacher known as the Maggid. This is the story of the Maggid Mizrich. That's how he became a follower of the Baal Shem Tov. So that's one approach. Another way we can think about this is that wine contains alcohol. Yes.
What about if you don't get drunk on wine?
Well, based on this, the drinking of the wine is more important than the getting drunk.
I'm saying most people nowadays don't get drunk on wine.
So there.
Well, what do you?
Are you asking me kabbalistically? Or you're asking me halachically?
Both.
Halachically, there's discussions about it. Is it being wine that important? Kabbalistically, there's a strong argument to be made, and there are people who are very more kabbalistically inclined. For some reason that I do not know, it does not seem to be the practice of Chassidim to be particular about drinking wine, but I do know that more Sephardic Kabbalists tend to be more particular about it being wine specifically. I can't tell you what I don't know. But going back to what I said previously, that a large part of Judaism is based on what we actually practice, not simply, well, this would make sense, right? There's always those two dimensions. So then there's also the human level, which is that wine contains alcohol, and the effect of alcohol, which is why it's related to joy, and also related to secrets, is that wine removes our sense of inhibition. Or alcohol. This is the second. Wine's effect on a person, if you want to oversimplify it, it has other effects, but the main effect we're interested in here is that it removes a person's sense of inhibition. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Generally, very bad. In very limited contexts, it can be good. Okay. So this idea is that a person's inhibitions may prevent them from being in touch with these spiritual secrets. And this is why we find that people may sometimes use alcohol in these contexts. Now, in what sense is the mind getting in the way? In what sense is what inhibition is getting in the way? So there are really two. One is the inhibition that is between people. So this is where like the Hasidic idea of having l'chaim et verbringen, which is the sense of removing the kind of inhibition that people feel with each other. By the way, how much alcohol do you have to drink for that? By the way, this is why social drinking exists in all societies. It removes a level of inhibition, right? Which is very useful for a certain degree of social bonding, and very, very bad if it goes beyond certain limits, right? But the other thing is that there is a kind of a deeper inhibition, which is we are rationally compelled, which means when something makes sense to us, we feel compelled to live our lives in accordance with that. And when something doesn't make sense to us, we feel compelled to reject it. Does that make sense? Now, the fact that something makes sense in some sort of theoretical sense or abstract, you can follow the arguments, not what I mean. I mean, like, when things really make sense to you, right? Which is why there's a strong argument to say that we are rational creatures. Now, a key teaching of Kabbalah and also Chassidus is that we are not fundamentally rational. Rationality is the first garment or the first way the soul presents itself, but it is actually not the essence of who we are. Or to put this Kabbalistically, higher than the sphere of Chachma, wisdom, is the sphere of Keser, and beyond that is the Ein Sof, is beyond the infant. And the soul, therefore, has desires that transcend reason, and the soul itself is beyond its own desires. And therefore, when we feel compelled to live life in accordance with our reason, we are in a certain sense cut off from the deeper truths of ourselves and deeper truth of God. The problem is our ability to live life effectively and properly in accordance with God's will very much depends on our use of reason. So there's this problem. And therefore the mystics say it can be appropriate in very limited situations to use the alcohol to remove one's ability to feel inhibited by their own reason.
What about my Shaltali?
This is the idea that Mayach Shalach Alev is a human nature, and it's very, very important, and there's times where that needs to be set aside for something that transcends that. That's exactly what this is about. And that would mean, by the way, that therefore this is not an ideal state to be in. Okay? I will have you note that Rabbi Zeru died on Purim. Yes? When did Rabbah revive him? Because not being able to function in this world because you've experienced something transcendent on Purim is not the end of the world. Maybe that's fine. Maybe that's consistent with what Purim is about. But it means you're supposed to live your life there. At the end of the day, you have to come back and live life using your reason to guide you to live in accordance with the will of God, right? So if Rabbi Zera stays dead, not able to function in the world, that's a problem, right? So there is a limited context in which this is available. This is appropriate. Now, but the problem is when you are not inhibited, nothing is inhibiting you. So unless you are anchored in your essence in what is right and what is wrong and what is the truth, what's going to happen? Things are not going to work out too well. Yes? So now we're going to move on to the biblical narrative. Aaron had two sons, Nadav and Avihu. Nadav and Avihu went into the temple, uninvited, into the Holy of Holies to offer incense. And they died. Our tradition has it that before they went in, they got drunk.
What word is it used there?
What?
When it's in they died.
I'm going to get to that in a second. They got drunk. And we can say that, why would they get drunk and go to the temple? So maybe what they were doing is a similar type of thing. They were trying to get in touch with this deeper core essence, and they got in touch with the insatiable desire of the soul to encounter God. And what's happened to the inhibition of reason, that maybe God didn't invite you in, maybe that's not what God wants of you, that went on the wayside. And so what happens? They rush in, yes, to the temple to offer the incense, which, by the way, technically wasn't even forbidden at that point. It wasn't that the actual law that you're not only allowed to go into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur was given after that. And then they die. How do they die? The Torah says that a fire came forth from before God and consumed them. Hashem. Now that expression is used a few verses earlier to describe God's acceptance of a sacrificial offering. So the people bring a sacrifice, and God's acceptance of the sacrifice is fire comes forth from before God and consumes the sacrifice.
So they were sacrificed?
In other words, they wanted to encounter God, and they didn't care that they were going to die in the process. And God said, okay. And in fact, afterwards, right, Moshe tells Aaron that they were in a certain sense holier and greater. Now, whether this was an example of obedience to God or not is a separate discussion. But the idea is that losing your inhibition, right, means that the deepest desires can come out, and maybe God responds. Now, in the context of what they did then, was that appropriate? No, it wasn't. We see that very clearly. But in the context of the story of Rabbah and Rabbi Zera, it seems to be, from the fact that Rabbah didn't bother to revive Rabbi Zera until the next day, that as long as it's happening within the confines of that singular day of Purim, it's not the end of the world. The main issue is that experience does not prevent you from going back and living life in accordance with the will of God, which requires you to live life based on your rationality of knowing what is right, knowing what is wrong, and guiding both your physical and spiritual passions in the right direction. So if you put all of this together, going back to the statement, Rava says you're supposed to drink until you don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And Chassidus understands that knowing something is ultimately superficial because knowledge is gained, which means at your essence you are fundamentally ignorant. You're either ignorant in the sense that you lack knowledge, or you are, we don't have a word for this, but you're beyond knowledge. You don't need the knowledge. If someone has not learned what is right and what is wrong, there's only two possibilities. They lack any sense of moral direction whatsoever, and therefore they might do the wrong thing, right? Or, alternatively, the difference between right and wrong is something that is essential to them, and therefore does not need to be known or learned. And the way Chassidus explains it is the idea of the drinking of Purim is to get in touch with that part of ourselves. And to be in touch with that part of ourselves, you have to let go of the rationality of the mind. And what Chassidus points out is letting go of the rationality of the mind by drinking a lot of alcohol so you get in touch with this tends not to be so effective for most people. However, studying Hasidus and trying to serve God to the best of your ability, acknowledging that deeper part of you exists, and then celebrating Purim with genuine joy will get you a lot further. And then we can discuss, how much if alcohol has a role to play. So from the perspective of Hasidus, the real secret that is being gained is the secret that my knowledge of what is right, and my knowledge of what is wrong, my knowledge of what is good, my knowledge of what is evil, is not something that I gain from my learning, from my experience, from divine revelation, from whatever. It's something that is innate in my being because I'm a Jew. I don't need to know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed and Mordechai. I am the difference between those two things. And getting yourself plastered drunk and acting like an idiot is not really the point. Yes.
Does getting drunk and wine also have to do with the simcha and breaking the
That does. However, the notion of simcha breaking boundaries is different on Purim because this goes back to the question you think about how much wine to drink. So on the pilgrimage festivals, there is the idea of having alcohol in order to have simcha, and there's a minimum requirement for men, which is 1 revius or 86 milliliters of wine, and if for some reason they can't drink wine, at least grape juice because it counts. But there is a maximum. What's the maximum? So in Talmudic times, in Talmudic times, how were the pilgrimage festivals celebrated? People would go to Jerusalem and bring sacrifices and celebrate. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen animals, but they tend to be somewhat large. You don't eat one by yourself, certainly not if you're bringing like a cow. So how do you think they celebrated these? A party. And you have to eat the meat when? Depending on the sacrifice that day, maximum the next day. And that's it. So you slaughter a cow, you've got to eat the whole cow within 2 days. A person can't eat a cow in a year, usually. You're eating all the meat. They're big. Even eating a whole goat. You can maybe, if you stuff yourself, get through a lamb by yourself. If you're not eating anything else in 2 days. I'm serious, there's a lot of there's a lot of food there, right? We're talking about not processed stuff. You can just, we're talking about real food, right? That fills you up.
Are you not allowed to get full just on meat?
Also true. So therefore, these things were celebrated with big parties. You would invite people. In fact, the Torah makes a way you should not just invite your family and friends. You should invite the widow and the orphan and the Levite who don't have, right? It's a big thing, right? And there's a mitzvah to rejoice, and there's the wine. So you can see how things can maybe get out of hand. So there were modesty police who would go around to make sure that none of these parties had too much drinking, that things started becoming appropriate. And the Rebbe points out, what? In temple times. Not in the base of Midrash. The people would eat in the city. Yeah. I mean, things did sometimes get out of hand. There was a Roman historian who writes that he's convinced that the Jews worship, which pagan god was it? Dionysus. Right? Dionysus is the one of wine and revelry and debauchery. Mm-hmm. He watched the Jews celebrating Purim. He's like, I don't know about this. Things are getting a bit out of hand. But the point is, Thomas is like, no, the rabbis really they set up the Sanhedrin trying to set up things there's limits here. You got to do that. And the Rebbe points out that when it comes to Purim, the Talmud is completely silent. Nobody set up any rules about anything. And the Rebbe's conclusion from this is that, yes, there's idea of breaking through boundaries, but breaking through boundaries doesn't mean that no boundaries need to exist. But on Purim, it's not so much about breaking through the boundaries, it's that you're beyond the need for boundaries. Right? In other words, even if there's no rules and no inhibitions, you're still going to do the thing that's right and not the thing that's wrong because that's just who you are. Because if it's about breaking through boundaries, as much as you break through boundaries, that could go off in the wrong directions. There need to be other kinds of boundaries. So that's, I guess, a bit of an overview of the drinking on Purim. And tomorrow we will start talking about some of the actual Chassidus in the Purim story and all these types of things. All right? Regardless of whatever decision you do decide to make about, yes, having some wine or not having some wine or whatever, it should obviously be done within the bounds of propriety. And more importantly, it should not distract from the main thing, which is doing the mitzvahs as halacha requires. And one of those is to actually be happy and rejoice. The Rebbe points out that the idea of being happy and rejoicing, it calls it the days of rejoicing. Yimei mishta v'simcha. So that even before you get to the Suda, you should be rejoicing and happy. Yes.
The mitzvah is only during the Seudah, right? So it doesn't spread out for 3 days of Purim.
So one can make the argument, because it says Yimei Mishta v'Simcha, that Mishta is all the times. One can make the argument. The context from the piece of the Talmud is it's talking about the Purim Seudah. So you can make those arguments. I like you mentioned all 3 days.